Greetings. My name is Nikki Frazier Curry. Welcome to the fiscal year 2024 FY24 CSBG Annual Report webinar series explaining eligible entity expenditures, capacity, and resources. I will pass it on to today's presenter, Lena Potanchian. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. We can click on the next slide. Welcome everyone and good morning or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. My name is Lena Kotanchin and I'm a data analyst on the Policy Data and Evaluation team. And I'm also a Policy Data and Evaluation Specialist for Region 8. Thank you for being here with us today. And I would also like to extend our welcome from our leadership team in the Office of Community Services. This webinar is part of the fiscal year 2024 CSBG Annual Report webinar series. We hope this webinar will help you with successful and timely completion of the fiscal year 2024 CSBG Annual Report, data from which will be used to tell the CSBG story and the impact that your work is making. Next slide. Today's webinar is intended for CSBG eligible entities completing eligible entity expenditures, capacity, and resources, the second module of the CSBG annual report, and for state lead agencies that will be reviewing the data prior to submission to OCS. Agenda for today includes fiscal year 2023 highlights, reporting requirements overview, best practices when working on your submissions, overview of sections A, B, and C, and some reminders and useful resources. Finally, we will conclude our webinar with Q&A portion. As a reminder, please use Q&A pod at the bottom of your screen for questions. We will address each question at the end of the webinar. Next slide. Today's webinar is delivered to you in collaboration with the National Association for State Community Services Programs, or NASCASP. My co-presenter, Tiffany Jarvis, is the Research Director at NASCASP. Next slide. Let's start with some fiscal year 23 eligible entity expenditures, capacity, and resources highlights. Please note that the data on the next couple of slides is inclusive of the 49 of the 53 states and territories with a complete and closed fiscal year 23 annual report submission. Next slide. I want to draw your attention to the CSBG expenditures by domain reported by eligible entities in fiscal year 2023. You can see that housing and health were the largest domains with 22% and 16% respectively. And that is the trend that we see when we aggregate the national data. However, the expenditure breakdown might look very different in your state or your agency, so you might find it useful to compare your data to the national aggregate. This information is shared through the report to Congress and ad hoc data requests that OCS may receive from other federal offices. So your data collection efforts with the annual report are critical in shaping the CSBG story. Next slide. Another couple of highlights that I want to bring to your attention. More than 19 million volunteer hours were donated to the eligible entities. So when we talk about leveraging the funds, we also want to make sure that we acknowledge the volunteers contributed an additional $138.8 million in value. And that is if all donated volunteer hours were estimated using the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. More than 60% of that, or 11.5 million of the total volunteer hours, were donated by individuals with low incomes. I want to pause for a second to make sure that that information sinks in with the network. This is the time to celebrate how lucky this network is to have all these incredible people who volunteer every day to make sure that every individual and family have what they need to achieve self-sufficiency. Additionally, the CSBG network worked with more than 180,000 organizations to promote family and community outcomes. If any, this is just another example that shows how rich this network is and how successful it is in helping individuals and families across the nation. Next slide. Now that we all got excited about the great achievements of this network, it is time to talk about the reporting requirements. Next slide. The annual report is a requirement born out of statutory authority, specifically the CSBG Act. Among other things, grant recipients should be submitting their reports annually, where they capture measured performance of the eligible entities, accounting of funds spent on administrative costs by eligible entities, direct service delivery, number and characteristics of participants served. Next slide. Of course, CSBG annual report has a due date, and we want to do a quick knowledge check with all of you. In the chat, please tell us when is the fiscal year 2024 CSBG annual report is due. We will give you guys about 15 seconds to answer in the chat. Don't be shy. I see the numbers in the chat growing. I think at this point we can reveal the answer. As you all correctly answered in the chat, it is option D. On the next slide, you'll see that fiscal year 24 CSBG annual report is due on March 31st, 2025 at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time in Grant Solutions. A couple of notes that in prior years, the annual report also included reports for CARES and/or disaster funding. These are no longer included since CARES and disaster supplements have been expended. Also note that fiscal year 24 annual report does not include the proposed changes of annual report 3.0. Next slide. During our webinars, we often use the phrase a complete submission. On this slide, I want to walk you through what a complete submission looks like for Module 2. I also want to note that information presented here also applies to Module 4. CSBG eligible entities submit their data to CSBG lead agency for the review. Once states and territories complete their review, they upload XMLs to the online data collection system known as OLDC. Complete submission entails successful submission of all XMLs for all reporting eligible entities. The rule of thumb, if the entity is reported in the state plan, it must be reflected in the annual report. Additionally, if the entity received and expended any funds between October 1st, 2023 through September 30th of 2024, they must submit a report. Of course, we understand that there could be changes such as de-designation or voluntary relinquishment after October 1st, but if the entity expended any funds and received and expended any funds, they should be reporting. We also understand that XMLs sometimes could fail in OLDC. Technology isn't perfect. So please check the status of each XML submission in OLDC to ensure that everything uploaded correctly. If you experience any issues during that process, please email your data and evaluation specialist and they will be able to assist you. If there are any comments clarifying your data, please attach the comment template in OLDC. Use your best judgment when it comes to a comment template. Comment on items that you anticipate to appear on the review memo or you think are important for us to know. Your data and evaluation specialist will share all the resources with you, including the comment template. Lastly, after all XMLs are successfully uploaded and you attach the comment template if you used one, do not forget to submit the state level form. Our ability to release review memos and move forward data mitigation, closeout, and further national reporting depends on the timely and complete submission of the fiscal year 24 CSBG annual report. Next slide. So now we will be moving on to reporting best practices. Next slide. Module 2 is the way to communicate information on how resources were allocated for each eligible entity. Eligible entities report 3 sections. Section A, eligible entity expenditures. Section B, capacity building. And Section C, allocated resources. In Section A, we're asking you to capture how CSBG leverages all the different types of activities. We're also asking all eligible entities to look for the best fitting domain when it comes to the CSBG expenditures. Consider if a work that is being reported could fit better under a different domain so that we all can tell an accurate CSBG story across the nation. For Section B, remember to report across all programs administered by an eligible entity when reporting volunteer hours, support by board members, partnerships, and staff certifications. And lastly, for Section C, report all available resources that contribute to the outcomes, services, and people served that are reported in Module 4. Please note that we're asking you to report all resources that were available during the reporting period, even if those resources might not have been fully expended. Next slide. Before we dive into each section into more detail, I want to quickly show you how different parts of the CSBG annual report are related to each other. You report allocation of available resources, including CSBG and non-CSBG funding, staff and agency capacity, ineligible entity expenditures capacity and resources, or Module 2. Then those resources are mobilized and utilized to deliver services that are reported under individual and family services, or Module 4, Section B. After participants receive services, they reach specific outcomes as they become more self-sufficient, which is recorded under individual and family national performance indicators, or Module 4, Section A. And lastly, demographic characteristics of those participants are captured in All Characteristics Report, or Module 4, Section C. So to simplify, when you report resources, we expect to see delivery of services using those resources, and then outcomes and demographics of participants who use those services. I hope this slide will help you to connect parts of the annual report and guide your successful fiscal year 24 submission. Next slide. And as promised, now we're diving into a detailed discussion of each section of the annual report. Next slide. Eligible entities will use reporting periods set by the CSBG lead agency. Please ensure that all agencies within the state are selecting the same reporting period. That will help us to ensure that all reported data is within a specific time frame. Next slide. Going back to connecting the parts of the annual report, if an agency is reporting CSBG expenditures under a specific domain, we expect to see reported services in that domain in Module 4, Section B. In the example on the slide, you can see that the agency is reporting $100,000 in employment expenditures, but does not report any services in employment domain. Best practice is to review the expenditures data against Module 4 services and resolve before submitting. As mentioned before, utilize your comment template to provide a comment if you anticipate to have an item on your review memo. Next slide. There is a data validation built in that indicates that 100% of the reported CSBG expenditures is in one domain. That is totally okay, and that can happen. And the warning is there just to ensure that is entered correctly and not an error. If you anticipate that there will be a comment on the review memo, again, go ahead and utilize the comment template. Next slide. Items are not only connected across the sections of the annual report, but also within the same section and even within the same data point. In this case, items A.2i and A.4 are connected. If the agency reports expenditures under A.2i, they must specify the funded activities under A.4. And vice versa, if the agency reports activities under A.4, they must specify the expenditures under A.2i. Additionally, please only report agency capacity building activities funded by CSBG dollars. Next slide. On this slide, there is a good example of how items are connected within the same data point. When you select Other under item 8.4.1, please remember to specify the other agency capacity building activities that were funded by CSBG dollars. Next slide. So we will do one more knowledge check before we move on to the next sections. Please put in the chat the response to the following question. If you report expenditures under 8.2i, agency capacity building, what other data points should you report? Option A, 8.2j, other expenditures. Option B, 8.4, details on agency capacity building activities. And option C, nothing. It is a trick question. We'll give a bit of time for participation. I see some answers coming in and they all are correct. So I think we can reveal. The correct answer is option B. If you report expenditures in agency capacity building, you need to report 8.4, which provides details on those activities. So now I'll pass it on to Tiffany Jarvis to walk us through sections B and C. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. Let's now turn our attention to section B, which is eligible entity capacity. In this section, you are going to be asked to report on agency capacity building and volunteer hours, staff certifications, and partnerships. For the most part, section B is straightforward. However, there are 3 areas that tend to have the most comments on the review memo, and we're going to be discussing these today. Next slide, please. B3A and B3A1 are data points that give some a challenge because they have a parent-child relationship. What do I mean by this? Basically, the children data points, in this case, B3A1, are subsets of a parent, in this particular case, B3A. The parent-child data points provide several clues letting you know that there is a relationship between them. There are 3 things in B3A that tells you that there is a parent relationship. First, B3A1 starts out with the phrase of the above. Next, B3A1 is indented rather than in line with B3A. And the third clue is B3A1 has a 1, whereas B3A does not. All of these 3 things together tells you the rules of the relationship for these 2 data points. B3A is asking you for all volunteer hours, regardless of who is volunteering. Whereas B3A1, a subset of 3BA, is asking of the total number of volunteer hours, how many were by individuals with low incomes. This tells you that B3A1 cannot exceed B3A. If it does, you will receive an error flag on your review memo. Remember, error messages are telling you that the data provided is incorrect and should be fixed, preferably before you submit your report. However, there is a rule of thumb that B3A1, even though it can equal B3A, it will generally be a smaller number. And if you report the same number for both on these data points, you will receive a warning flag on your review memo. Remember, warning messages are asking you just to double check what is being reported. When reviewing, if you discover that it is not correct, then it should be fixed. If it is correct, then you're just being asked to confirm that this is the case. Next slide, please. B4G and B4G1 through B4G4, mouthful there, as are also parent-child data points. B4G is the parent, asking for an unduplicated count of all staff members who had at least 1 energy professional certification. While the 4 children do not have the language clue of the above, it is implied. Additionally, the children data points use the indentation and the 1 through 4 numbering clues. And again, these clues tell you about the relationship, which is B4G1, through B4G4 are asking what specific types of energy professional certifications the staff members reported under for B4G have. Following the same rule as the volunteer data points that we discussed in the previous slide, the children data points B4G1 through B4G4 individually cannot exceed B4G. Please do not confuse the relationship where it requires the children data points to aggregate together to equal the parent. With B4G and its children, the rule is that each child cannot exceed the parent. And if the child is larger, then it will result in an error flag. Because each child is individually compared to the parent, you could receive 1 to 4 validation errors on your review memo. For example, if B4G1 and B4G3 are larger than B4G, you will receive 2 error flags, 1 for each child that is larger than the parent. Let's look at the example provided here. There are 30 staff members who have at least 1 energy professional certification. Of those 30, 15 have an energy auditor certification. 20 have the retrofit installer technician certification. 3 have the crew leader certification, and 6 have the QCI certification. It is okay for a staff member to be reported under more than one of the children data points if that individual has more than 1 certification. Next slide, please. The final area under section B that can result in a flag is B4M. This is because this data point, if being reported on, requires 2 things before it is considered complete. First, you need to provide an unduplicated number of staff members who have at least 1 certification that has not already been captured under B4A through B4L. Second, you need to specify what those certifications are. The validation rule is if B4M is greater than 0 and nothing is in the text box, then it is considered an incomplete submission for this data point and will be flagged as an error. This is also true if there are certifications reported in the text box, but B4M is 0. When reporting a number for B4M, remember that it is an unduplicated number similar to what was reported under B4G, which we discussed on the previous slide. The rule is that each staff member is reported only once, regardless of how many other certifications they have. And while you can, if it is your preference, but you do not need to, you can report the number of staff members that have that specific other certification. But again, that is not a requirement. As the sample example shows, you just need to list what the other certifications are. Next slide, please. Okay, so now let's do a knowledge check for section B. Using your chat, please indicate if this is a true or false statement. B3A1 can exceed B3A. We'll give you a few moments to enter either A or B. Okay, I think we could probably go to the next slide and show the answer. It is false, as I saw most people answer that. It's false because B3A1 is a child data point of B3A, the parent, and it uses the cannot exceed rule. So that's the reason why it's false, because B3A, according to this, can exceed, which is not true. Excuse me, B3A1 cannot exceed B3A. Next slide, please. Let's now turn our attention to Module 2, Section C, and this is where you're reporting resources your agency receives. Next slide, please. One thing to remember when reporting on C2 is that it's asking for all CSBG resources allocated. Remember, allocated means what is available to you that you can expend during that fiscal year. So when it comes to your CSBG allocation, it includes your regular allocation for the fiscal year and any carryover funds from the previous fiscal year. It also includes any discretionary funds received during the fiscal year and any funds that were carried over from the previous fiscal year. Again, I want to highlight the CSBG discretionary dollars and its inclusion under C2. Sometimes we see CSBG discretionary dollars recorded under other HHS, which is incorrect and will be flagged on your review memo. Next slide, please. Now let's look at C2 compared to C4A. C2 are all funds received that are under the federal CSBG Act. These funds are given to the state CSBG lead agency for distribution to the eligible entities. It is important to remember for this data point and any others under Section C, you must consider the point of origin because most federal dollars are passed through to a state or local government before reaching the agency. C4A, on the other hand, is asking for state appropriated funds for the same purpose as federal CSBG funds. From the CSBG Annual Report Instructions Manual, this is defined as funds that were appropriated by the state legislature to be used in line with the federal criteria for CSBG. We just ask that you keep this definition in mind when determining if C4A is the appropriate data point to use or if these funds would be best captured elsewhere. Next slide, please. So when Lena was presenting, she was talking about the Module 2 and Module 4 connection. And during the review process, there are some data points in Section C that will be reviewed for this connection. First, if the agency reported that weatherization services were provided under Module 4, Section B, then it is expected that funds would be reported under C3A or C3B2. If no funds are reported, then you will receive a warning flag for these two data points. Please note that the validation only looks to see if at least C3A or C3B2 is completed. The validation is not looking for both were completed because an agency may only receive one source of funding. Also note that there are times when an agency is using services for R through 4T to capture assistance provided to clients, but may not be using federal funds to do so. That is why it's a warning flag, not an error flag. And if this is the case for your agency, then you're just encouraged to use the comments template to provide an explanation of why nothing is reported under C3A and or C3B2. Also, please note that the reverse is true. If there are funds reported, then services are expected. Since this is a Module 4 validation check, we'll go more into that later in the later webinar. But for today's webinar, we just wanted to let you know that the connection does go both ways. Next slide, please. Another Module 2, Module 4 connection that will be a part of the review process is C3B3 and C3B4. If the agency reported that it had her early Head Start services were provided under Modules 2 Service 2A, Module 4 Service 2A, then it is expected that funds would be reported under C3B4. If the agency reported that Head Start services were provided under Module 4 Service 2B, then it is expected that funds would be reported under C3B3. Again, please note that there are times when an agency is using either Service 2A or Service 2B, but it is not reporting federal funds received because under Module 2, Section C, because it's not using federal funds to provide these services. Again, that's why there's a warning flag, not an error flag. And if it is the case, then you're encouraged to use the comments template to provide an explanation of why there's services but no federal expenditures. And again, with the weatherization example, Head Start, early Head Start example is the same. It goes both ways. If funds are reported, then services are expected. Again, it's a Module 4 validation, and we'll go more into that in a later webinar. But again, we just want you to know that there is a connection and it does go both ways. Next slide, please. Another area under Section C that receives many flags is C3B12, other HHS resources. There are two reasons for this. First, the little 1 through little 4 requires 3 things to be considered complete. You need to provide a description of the resource, such as LIWAP, as you see on the screen. You also need to provide the CFDA number. And because the CFDA number is missing on this example that you see on your screen, it would result in an error flag because this data point is not considered complete. Had the agency entered 93.499 under this field, it would have been considered complete. Also, please remember that the CFDA numbers use the same format, which is number, point, number, such as LIWAT 93.499. The final thing that is needed is the amount allocated. If any of these three items are missing or the CFDA number is not in the correct format, it will be flagged as an error. I also want to note that other HHS only allows you to enter 4 entries. This is because OLDC will not accept more than this. Another thing to remember when using other HHS funds is that you should not list funds that are better allocated list funds that are better captured elsewhere. For example, funds received from weatherization, LIHEAP, Head Start, or Early Head Start should be captured under the data points that you see listed on your slide. It doesn't matter if you receive multiple grants from these sources, they should all be aggregated together and reported in the appropriate data point. For example, the agency receives both regular and bill weatherization funds. These would be aggregated together and reported under C3A. And while not shown on the screen, remember the CSBG allocation slide. This is where we talked about using C2 to capture CSBG discretionary funds and not C3B12. Outside of the example listed on your screen and CSBG, there are other HHS allocations received that may be more appropriately captured under another data point other than C3B12. And capturing these under other HHS is not accurate. For example, in FY23, an agency reported Title IIIC nutrition services under other HHS. However, this program is under the Older Americans Act, which should have been reported under C3B5, not C3B12 as it was. A best practice is to double check where the funds originated from before using C3B12. If you perform a simple internet search of either the program name or the CFDA number, you can easily learn if C3B12 is a good place or if another data point is better. This will help ensure that you submit an accurate report. Another common validation issue concerns C3B13. Notice that this data point says auto-calculate. That is your clue. This language clues you to an indication that it is the sum of other data points. And in this particular case, it means that C3B13 is the sum of all entries reported under C3B12. It will be flagged as an error if C3B12, little 1 through little 4, do not aggregate together and equal what is reported under C3B13. Next slide, please. Similar to C3B12, other HHS resources, there is other federal resources, and the same 3 things that are required under HHS other are also required here, and that is description, a CFDA number in the correct format, and the amount allocated. Again, if anything is missing or the CFDA number is not in the correct format, it will be flagged as an error. And just for a final remembrance, that the CFDA number is number, point, number. Also, it is important for report accuracy that you implement the best practice that we talked under C3B12 also applies to C3L. And that is making sure you're putting your allocation in the correct data point. There are several examples from FY23 where C3L was not the best place to capture these funds, but was used by an agency. For example, several agencies reported VITA resources under other federal. However, a quick search of this program shows that these funds are actually originating from the Department of Treasury, which is data point C3K. Another example that an agency reported was Keep 'em Safe Car Seat Program, and it was reported under C3L. However, it is a Department of Transportation program and should have been reported under C3H. A final example being provided here is that an agency reported FYSB Street Outreach under Other Federal. However, it is an HHS program, so actually C3B12 was the better place to report it instead of C3L. So again, it's important to make sure you know where the funds originate to make sure that you're using other correctly and not putting funds that should be captured elsewhere under this data point. Another common validation issue concerns C3M. Again, this data point is auto-calculate. This language clue is telling you it is a sum of other data points. And in this particular case, it means that C3M is the sum of all entries reported under C3L. And it will be flagged as an error if C3L, little 1 through little 4, do not aggregate together and equal what is reported under C3M. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to do another knowledge check for section C. Using chat, please indicate which is the correct CFDA format. Give you a few moments to enter A, B, or C, or D in the chat. Okay, next slide, please. Gold star. Everybody, from what I saw, had the correct answer, which is B, because the CFDA numbers use the number, point, number format. We're going to have one more knowledge check. So if we go to the next slide, please. So using the chat, please indicate which of the 3 funding sources listed here should have not been reported under C3L. We're going to give you a few moments to enter A, B, or C in the chat. Okay, I think we've got enough going on there. So again, gold star to everybody that participated, because option C is the incorrect option, or which is the answer that you should have been providing in the chat, because it's incorrect, because these are Department of Energy weatherization funds, which should be reported under C3A. So remember, all DOE WAP funds are aggregated together. So if they received bill funds and regular DOE WAP allocation, it all should be aggregated under C3A. Next slide, please. So like other HHS and other federal data points, there is an other state. However, there is a primary difference between the federal others and the state other, and that is that there is no CFDA number for state resources. That is only on the federal side. And for this particular data point, an agency's complete response under state other would be to include the description and the amount allocated. As with the federal others, OLDC limits you to 4 state other entries. So C4N is limited to 4 entries in OLDC. Another common validation issue concerns C4O. It's similar to the federal other. Again, notice that this data point says auto-calculate. This is a language clue indicating that it is a sum of other data points. And in this particular case, it means that C4O is the sum of all entries reported under C4N. It will be flagged as an error if C4N little 1 through little 4 do not aggregate together and equal what is reported for C4O. Next slide, please. One final thing before I conclude my portion is that I want you to bring back your attention to the Section C connection with Module 4. Early in this presentation, Lena showed you a similar slide. This slide you now see provides you with an example of this connection in action. What you see on the screen is that an agency has received emergency solution grant funds from HUD, which was reported under C3D6. And because of those funds, the agency was able to provide rapid rehousing services to clients. Now, a quick aside, this is just one of the ways ESG funds could be used. And just for today's example, that's what we're going to be focusing on, is just the rapid rehousing purpose. The agency would report the rapid rehousing services that were provided under Module 4, Section B. And depending on specifically how the client was assisted, the agency may use Service 4C, 4D, 4J, and or 4K to capture the service or services that were provided. Please note that this is not an inclusive list. There may be other services not listed on the slide that may have also been provided by the agency, and the agency will report on under Module 4, Section B. Another Module 4 connection is that because services were provided with the resources received, the client may have achieved one or more outcomes. In this particular example, the outcome that would be achieved because of the ESG allocation is FNPI 4B, obtain safe and affordable housing. Again, this is not an inclusive list. There may be other FNPIs not listed on the slide that the agency could report on to capture other outcomes the client achieved because of the service. The final part of Module 2, Section C and the Module 4 connection is that the agency would capture the demographics of the clients receiving ESG services under Module 4, Section C, which is the All Characteristics Report. The takeaway from this slide is that Modules 2 and 4 are not standalones, but interconnected with each other, and it is important to consider this when completing the CSBG annual report. We will unpack more about this during the Module 4 webinar, which is on November 21st. But for now, just take that away from this presentation. I will now turn it back over to Elena.
Thank you, Tiffany, for walking us through sections B and C. And now we will get into the final portion of this webinar. Next slide. In the action transmittal, we detailed 3 categories of resources: tools, training, and technical assistance. The tools are the tangibles and the things you need to complete the annual report, such as smart forms or vendor portal, in case if you're using the third-party system, AllDC, where you upload all the XMLs. Trainings are the dynamic conversations we review with clear objectives. And technical assistance is the homework, how you may be applying the knowledge of PEAK and how we can help you better use that information. And of course, our goal is to see you all win and succeed. I will spend a little bit more time talking about each one of those in more detail. Next slide. Please note the important links that are referenced on this slide, and my colleague is sharing them in the chat. From the OCS Community Services blog grant homepage, you can access our CSBG Annual Report Toolkit, CSBG Events Calendar, and the CSBG Webinars by scrolling to the bottom of the page and dropping down to grant recipient resources. You will then be able to access the applicable links and resources as noted in the bottom photo on the slide. If you need any additional support, please reach out as soon and as often as you need. CSBG Annual Report Toolkit is available now and updated regularly. The toolkit has the Module 1 fillable tool that I know a lot of you are using, AllDC instruction guide, and other materials. Next is a vendor portal that is hosted on the NASCAS website as part of the OCS-funded cooperative agreement. As I mentioned before, the vendor portal is specific to those grant recipients that use a third-party system to submit their data. And the webinar on December 3rd will review this tool in more detail. Next, the Online Data Collection System, or AllDC, is where all grant recipients, states, tribes, and territories must submit their complete annual report. And lastly, there is a NASCAS training and technical assistance tools that were developed under the CSBG Performance Management Alignment Training and Technical Assistance Cooperative Agreement. Next slide. Upcoming trainings can be found via our CSBG Events calendar page. There are several upcoming webinars that will be shared on the next slide, and you can also access on-demand webinars that have been recorded and saved on the link provided in the chat. The annual report kickoff webinar and module 1 webinar are now available at this link. Next slide. So here are the remaining topics and dates for fiscal year 2024 annual report training webinar series, which again can be found in the action transmittal on the CSBG Events calendar page. We have 5 more webinars, so do not forget to register and have them on your calendars. And I'll pause for a second so you can, if you need to take note of that. We can move to the next slide. And of course, please join us during our next webinar, Capturing Community Level Transformation, or Module 3. This webinar will take place on November 19, 2024 from 1 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and we'll review Module 3 of the CSBG Annual Report and provide strategies and best practices for submitting your community transformation initiatives. Again, don't forget to register for it and have them on your calendar. Next slide. Lastly, for targeted and general technical assistance, please reach out to your assigned program specialist and policy data and evaluation specialist. As you know, we work closely as a team and request that you include both contacts when you reach out. And you can find regional contacts on the page shared in the chat. Another note that OCS will host fiscal year 24 annual report office hours that will occur on March 4th and March 6th of 2025. More information will be provided as we're getting closer. Next slide. I also wanted to provide you with Tiffany's contact information on this slide and also in the chat. Next slide. Thank you, everyone, and thank you so much for participating in the chat. You guys were very, very active, so thank you for that.